Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover the latest happenings in Ottawa, including Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's surprising resignation and what increasingly feels like the beginning of the end of the Trudeau government. David, thanks for joining us. I'm sorry for interrupting your vacation.
Well, it's an important day and an important hour, so I'm glad to be with you.
Let's start with Chrystia Freeland's resignation. What do you make of it? What's your top line reaction?
Well, I read this great Twitter post just a few minutes ago, posted by someone you may know yourself, that explained that this is the working out of decisions that are actually 4 years old, or nearly so. That governments all around the world had to make a decision during the COVID crisis how much stimulus to give, monetary and fiscal, to their economy to get their countries through a genuine demand crisis. And as you pointed out, the Trudeau government's decision seems to have been quite random. They just picked a number out of thin air. It doesn't seem to have been based on anything. And as you said, it was just pick a number between 50 and $200 billion. And they spent that with they determined to spend it. And then even as the crisis began to abate in the later part of 2021, they kept spending, creating enormous inflationary pressure. Of course, Canada was also receiving inflationary pressures at secondhand from the United States, where the Biden administration made similar go big decisions. And what we are now seeing is the government being devoured by the consequence of that choice. And of course, their other choice, which you point out in that same important Twitter message, about opening the doors to immigration without any seeming strategic plan.
Yes, I happen to agree with you. But one thing that
yourself.
strikes, pardon me?
You're agreeing with yourself. I'm quoting you.
One thing that strikes me, David, about Freeland's resignation, though, is it seems to have been designed to do maximum damage to the Prime Minister and the government. It follows an announcement over the weekend that the Housing Minister is also resigning. Are we seeing the unraveling of Prime Minister Trudeau's control over the government?
Yeah. Well, I think what a lot of people will notice about the statement, as you said, is look, governments get consumed by forces beyond their control. Or
Yes.
sometimes you make a big decision like that in 2021, and it turns out to be wrong from the perspective, or too much from the perspective of 2024. And people look back on it and say, well, that was a mistake, but it was a good faith mistake.
Yes.
What you have here is the key financial decision maker of the government saying the prime minister was being whimsical and capricious. So she's taking away the one excuse that the Trudeau government would have, which is, well, maybe we were wrong. A lot of smart people were wrong. We were wrong in good company, and we were doing our best and trying our hardest. And his own finance minister saying, no, that's not true. You've been acting selfishly. You've been acting for political reasons. And in fact, your right-hand person in these most important decisions, have completely lost confidence in your ability to carry on the government. So the policy failure on two fronts, stimulus and immigration, is now joined to a personal critique that comes from the person best placed to evaluate Justin Trudeau as a political leader.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask that precise point. Do you want to comment on how Prime Minister Trudeau has handled these issues in recent days and more broadly? How much should we understand these challenges as a reflection of his leadership versus other factors?
Yeah. Well, look, he is caught up in something bigger than himself,
Yes.
bigger than Canada. And I think from a point of view, when the time comes to analyze where to go, what to do next, this is not a made in Canada problem exactly. I mean, it was worsened in Canada, but the deluge of liquidity was coming from the United States and from other countries in Canada. However perfectly it had anticipated the amount of stimulus to do, would have been buffeted by inflationary and demand shocks.
Yes.
Ed, I think all Canadians, even those who kind of like Trudeau, now have a sense of a basically frivolous approach to government, a basically perception approach to government. The point is made by many people, including people who used to be close to him, that this has been a government that has always been about communications first, policy second, rather than the other way around. And that does catch up with you. One of the kinds of justice that is in a parliamentary system is Canadian prime ministers typically stay or politically successful and stay for a while.
Yes.
9 years, 10 years. That's quite common for Canadian prime ministers to last that long. And that's enough time for your mistakes to catch up to you.
Indeed.
And I mean, in the United States, it's often true that you can make bad decisions and have your successor pay the price. But in Canada, if you're there for 10 years, the decisions you made in years one, two, three, four are very much the decisions you feel the consequences of in years eight, nine, 10, and after.
Yeah, well said. Just in parentheses, if you step back and looked at the key pillars of the Trudeau government's current agenda, a lot of it involves undoing or correcting mistakes that it made in earlier years. And as you say, that's not unique to this government. I used to joke, David, that when I worked for Stephen Harper, our final election platform ought to commit to fixing all of the mistakes we'd previously made and making the case that we were uniquely positioned to fix them because, of course, we were the ones responsible for them in the first place.
That sounds farcical, but in fact, look, no human enterprise is conducted without mistakes. And government's a human enterprise. Of course, governments make mistakes, um, and anyone who's promising a mistake-free government is promising a government that is not run by human beings. And there is something to be said that yes, if you know where you went wrong, you have it to do all over again. But that requires a degree of seriousness about your approach to problems that seems to be
Yes.
missing. I think that's a reason why the seemingly remote question of the Middle East has been so important to the end of the Trudeau government because it sort of captures that kind of government by sprinkler head, which is like we're over here, then we go over here, and then we whip back over here. And there has been no one's there never seems to have been an impulse to sit down and say, let's have a meeting within the first 48 hours after the Hamas attacks on Israel and say, what's our approach going to be? How Israel leaning are we going to be? How Israel leaning are we going to not be? We can predict that there is going to be a retaliation coming. It's going to be heavy. Where do we want to be on that? Instead, every day is something different. Now, that's something that's pretty remote from the lives of most Canadians, but on anti-inflation policy, too, it seems that every day brings something different, culminating with the farcical collapse of this Christmas season tax holiday, which now seems to be falling about the government's ears the way the rest of their economic portfolio is falling about their ears.
Yeah, I think the relationship between the two is really insightful. As you said, David, the Prime Minister and the then Minister of Finance rolled out both a tax sales tax holiday on certain products, as well as a proposal to issue helicopter money in the form of $250 checks in the name of trying to bolster their deteriorating political status. And I think what they underestimated was the extent to which, as you say, it would play into precisely this feeling that there's something kind of inherently unserious about the government at an increasingly serious time. Um, Talking about serious people, you've probably heard speculation that former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney may at some point join the government. What could possibly prompt him to assume a cabinet role in this context?
Messianic self-delusion. No, but sometimes here would be the case for it, which is sometimes the streetcar pulls up and it's kind of crowded, and maybe you don't want to go on board the streetcar, but you have no idea when the next streetcar will come along, and that one may be even more crowded. So, for lack of another streetcar, for lack of a better option, you get on board the streetcar that's in front of you. That there may be that. He wants to be prime minister, it looks like, and you can see how, with a lot of self-reassurance, you could believe, well, the problem with this government is Justin Trudeau. The government may be more popular than Trudeau himself. By the way, that's not a crazy thing to think. That probably is true. The Liberal Party
Yes,
is probably at this point a better brand than Justin Trudeau. So if I
yes.
can get on board the streetcar, switch out the conductor or the driver of the streetcar, then we can pilot the streetcar more successfully. And just maybe the shock of the Trump election will scramble political calculations enough that I think that's probably what he's thinking.
Well, I want to take up the Trump election precisely next, David, because we were together in Toronto a couple of weeks ago for a wonderful evening. Just in parentheses, I want to thank you. I know our audience enjoyed your wit and charm and insight a great deal. And one of the things you talked about was the difference in the standing of the incoming Trump administration vis-a-vis the Trudeau government this time relative to 2015, 2016. Do you want to talk about the difference and why it matters?
When Donald Trump came to power the first time, the Trudeau government had to manage that. And by and large, they did it in a reasonably successful way. That first government also contained a lot of dangers to Canada. The Trudeau government did work to mollify many of them. And while USMCA is a more protectionist agreement than the old NAFTA, Canada came out of it relatively unscathed. And at reasonable, it's not, you would wish none of this had to be happened, but with reasonable concessions, saved the most important considerations. And I made the point there that a lot of the relatively responsible way that this was handled was a function of the timetable. So Trudeau's elected in 2015, and he's got a majority, so he's got 4 years of government. Trump's elected in 2016. They're going to cohabit for quite a long time. And there's no point doing cheap politics because cheap politics will catch up with you before Trudeau's reelection in 2019. And indeed, he survived the 2019 election. This time it's flipped. This time it's Trump first and Trudeau second. So Trump's elected in 2024. Trudeau faces the electorate in 2025. The cohabitation will be relatively short. And there's a lot of temptation to be Captain Canada because I was just looking at Ipsos Reid poll today. I think it was an Ipsos poll that showed Trudeau and the Trudeau Liberals and the NDP neck and neck, each at about 21.
Yes.
If that with Trudeau down 5 points in September. So 21-21, put that through a Westminster style system. And that could be anywhere from 80 seats to 5. I mean, it could be a calamity. And the key to survival, or at least putting a cushion under whatever's going to happen for the Trudeau Liberals, is to consolidate left votes as much as possible behind Trudeau. If those same 42 points were distributed 3-1 instead of 50-50, the Liberals could be looking at reasonably acceptable outcome. They'd lose power, but they'd be well positioned to retake it again.
Yes.
So that there are a lot of temptations there, and they're very hazardous.
Well, just to stay on this line of discussion, talk about the risks for Canada here. What does it mean, David, to have an unstable government that increasingly lacks credibility in the face of the incoming Trump administration? How might a weakened prime minister be exploited by Trump?
Well, all our indications are, and of course, the Trump administration has not taken office yet, but that Trump this time is much more committed to tariffs than he was in term one. They're going to be bigger and earlier. At least that's what Trump says is going to happen. So instead of Canada having some number of years to deal with the renegotiation of NAFTA, to deal with other Trump threats, Trump's in first term, his big protectionist year was 2019, his third. There was not that much trade action in 2017 and 2018. He was consumed with other priorities, including not working very hard. But in 2019, the protectionism began to bite, and then came COVID in 2020, and so it cut short the looming trade conflict. This time, it looks like it's going to start from the beginning. So Canada needs a strategy, and as we've discussed in many venues, I think you basically need to prepare 2 tracks. Let's call them the standard track and the emergency track. The standard track says Canada should meet the threat of Trump 2 the same way it met Trump 1, the same way it's met other unwelcome trade actions from the United States. I was reading a new book about the Johnny MacDonald administration, and the Americans tore up a fishing treaty in the first Johnny MacDonald government, and the Canadians had to figure out how are they going to put the fishing treaty back together again. And there's a well-established playbook that goes back to then, which is mollify the Americans with small concessions, look for allies within the American system of government, especially at the state level, and put together enough friends on the other side of the border with enough concessions and some threat, but not a very major one, of some retaliation, and that's your strategy. And
yes.
And how this was updated for the present in a very intelligent and well-informed Twitter thread by former conservative leader Erin O'Toole. That's the standard track, and you absolutely have to. That's probably where 70% of your energy should go, and that's what was done in 2017, and it was quite successful. But you and I have discussed, given the apparent much more intense focus of Trump too on tariffs, you need an emergency track where you're thinking much bigger ideas, much more upsetting ideas, and you need to be prepared for that. And that team has to. One of the reasons that instability is dangerous, that team has to have great secrecy, because many of the ideas you're talking about are going to be kind of outlandish and maybe even offensive if people hear about them. If they're never needed, they should go in a file and be burned and never seen again.
Yes.
But that an unstable government doesn't keep secrets very well. And so if you need to come up with an emergency response to back up your standard response, you're going to need secrecy. You're also going to need some assurance that by the people in that room that no one is going to turn their words against them for political advantage. So if you bring a bunch of ministerial and sub-ministerial people into a working group, say, I want to hear some out there ideas, people are going to be frightened. Well, what if I say an out there idea that maybe hurts some Canadian interest or maybe upsets some people, and it leaks in 6 weeks? Not only is it bad for the idea, it's bad for me. And if I can't trust the other people in this room to work with me, then I'm not going to say anything. I'm not anything creative anyway. And so the instability threatens the very ability to do that kind of emergency thinking that is needed.
We've often talked, David, about the proper strategy for the Conservatives in the official opposition. You've consistently made the case that governments defeat themselves, and that ought to inform how the Conservatives are thinking about the case that they're prosecuting against the government and how they're positioning themselves with the Canadian public. I'll set aside a victory lap for you and a cause for vindication. Perhaps more importantly, how should the Conservatives respond now? Do they keep following your advice, or do they need to make any adjustments in light of the instability that we've seen just in the past 24 hours or so?
No, this is the moment where the matador switches from cape to sword, and is, if you want in a bullfight, you get the bull to defeat itself. The point of the cape is to give the bull a false target to charge at, exhaust itself, and then comes the kill with the sword. So this is the moment for that, where the government is falling, but its fall can be accelerated both by things that happen in Parliament. The leader of the opposition had one of those powerful video moments when he asked that question, I think just today, to the new acting finance minister, who are you? Because it reminds people of just what's happened, but
Yes.
also parliamentary things. So this is the moment to begin to give people some comfort that if this government ends its career, that there is a plan to stabilize prices and restore competitiveness. And you have to keep this double knowledge in mind. Is the immediate problem that people are experiencing is high prices, especially for housing, but all kinds of high prices. But the only long-term solution is not a price strategy, it's a productivity strategy. Canadians work hard, but the work doesn't translate into the same results as it translates south of the border for a lot of reasons. Some of them we know, some of them that are still kind of mysterious. But that's what you have to be saying. The goal is it's a 5 to 8 year goal of accelerating productivity growth so that hard work leads to satisfactory outcomes.
As we wrap up, I have to ask, what should listeners and viewers be looking for next in your mind, David? How should we make sense of this fast-moving political saga?
Yeah. Well, as we speak today, in fact, in the very hours that we're speaking, Justin Trudeau will be making a decision about possibly proroguing Parliament, conceivably resigning, although that seems very likely. Making Parliament stop meeting is a way of ending the cudgeling, and embattled prime ministers have often used prorogation before as a way of just make it stop. It doesn't make it stop forever, because sooner or later Parliament does have to meet again, and they've stored up a lot of energy, but there may be some movement toward an earlier election there, and I assume that what he's going to do is try to prorogue and then try to negotiate a new kind of power support deal with the NDP to keep his government going on. I mean, I was talking to someone who's a venerable political consultant who said there's a phase in the government's career where the front bench, they give up everything except the desire to hold on to their car and driver for a few more weeks. And we may be at that phase. Just let me have my car and drive. Let me just not have to drive myself until the snow melts.
David, I want to wrap up with a bigger picture question. As you said, we've had dozens of conversations this year. They've taken us from Ottawa to Toronto to Calgary, and of course, online every couple of weeks. Why don't we just end what amounts to our final conversation of 2024 with some reflection on some of the big ideas that we've discussed and what you're looking forward to as we wrap up this year and enter 2025.
I have been struck. I've been traveling a lot in Canada since the election. I've done many events to different kinds of groups, public events, business groups, educational groups. I am struck. I cannot remember in a very long time the degree of deep pessimism about the future of the country that I've heard since the Trump election, and it's very alarming to me. It's very painful to me. I think it's unjustified, and I think what people are doing is letting crisis thinking drive their long-term thinking. That all the material resources of the country are there. All the long tradition of political stability is there. The high levels of skill and the habits of social and economic cooperation, they're all there. And that what you have are the possibility for beneficial exchanges and cooperation, but that's not thwarted, but it doesn't achieve its fullest fruition because there are obstacles to making decision making and action as productive as it is in the United States. So, and maybe that will always be true. Maybe just the sheer fact of the fact that the country's long and skinny and not rather than it's a line, not a rectangle. Maybe that just imposes costs that are always going to be there. But the costs have been smaller in the past, or the differential has been smaller in the past, and it could be smaller in the future. So everything that Canada has is all still there. The country is not facing existential crisis. It is not facing some deep impediment to its ability to produce goods and services. There are very specific failures, and they can be overcome. So I do hope that for 2025, our New Year's wish is one of a recovery of optimism, and it's important because pessimism is self-sustaining. When Franklin Roosevelt said at the depth of the Depression, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he wasn't just coining a phrase. He was referring to the way that fear can be paralytic. And that exactly when you most need to keep your nerve, if fear haunts you, at that moment you lose the nerve and you lose the ability to do the things you would have done had you kept your nerve. So Canadians need to keep their nerve, keep their self-belief, be aware of the extraordinary capabilities of the country, and be mindful they have some very specific problems, some very specific inefficiencies. The finances are out of order. There are a lot of impediments to using the factors of production efficiently. It seems impossible to build things, but the obstacles to getting things built are all ad hoc, man-made. They were imposed. They can be removed. So let's hope that this season of shock leads to a season of building, many seasons of building. There's a lot to build.
What a wonderful way to not just wrap up this conversation, but a year's worth of conversations. David, I want to say on behalf of myself and the entire Hub audience, how grateful we've been able to draw on your experience and wisdom over what has been a pretty complicated and at times tumultuous year. I want to wish you and your family the best of the holiday season, and I look forward to catching up early in 2025.
All good wishes to you, and may you have a happy new year. Bye-bye.